Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Salatu wassalam ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to enable this gathering to be in our scale of good deeds. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to reward each and every one of you for the time that you spare for His sake. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to enable this to be a benefit, that we exit from this gathering with hearts more steadfast on the path, more loving of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, more following of the Prophet alayhi salatu wassalam. Ameen. Welcome to the last installment of this series between Halal and Haram, where we are kind of studying just one chapter actually of the very interesting book Al-Halal wal Haram fil Islam, the lawful and the prohibited in Islam, written by Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi. And so I will actually share a link right now with the presentations, just so that everybody has them. And of course, the organizers, if they can, take those links, inshallah, and share them as well via email, that would be great. So this is it. This is the last session, subhanAllah. So we will cover a few principles, the last few principles, inshallah, and then as well open the floor for comments, questions, and reflections, inshallah. So that is the plan for today. So let's dive right in. We'll start with the best of speech, the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. قل إنما حرم ربي الفواحش ما ظهر منها وما بطن والإثم والبغي بغير الحق وأن تشركوا بالله ما لم ينزل به سلطانا وأن تقولوا على الله ما لا تعلمون." Which translates to say, "My Lord has only forbidden open and secret indecencies, sinfulness, unjust aggression, associating others with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in worship, a practice that He has never authorized, and attributing to Allah what you do not know." This is in Surah Al-A'raf, and it is a very kind of on-point, verse in the Quran that covers pretty much the principles that we will touch upon today, inshallah. Like we said, we are diving into the book Al-Halal wal Haram fil Islam, the lawful and the prohibited in Islam, by Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi, originally published in 1960. He, rahimahullah, passed away in 2022. And this book is a very key book. It's a very simple book. It's a very easy to understand book and very easy to digest book as well. And so I recommend that you check it out. It is translated, by the way. You will find an English translation for it available. I could also share that link, inshallah, as well. Or the organizer can perhaps check that out and share a link just so that it's accessible, inshallah. And we're going to start with principle number 8 up to 11. So we'll be covering 4 principles today, inshallah. Principle number 8. We covered 7 principles, alhamdulillah. This is now the 8th principle. And so it is titled, "Good intentions do not justify what is prohibited." In other words, what is haram cannot be justified with good intentions. So the Arabic of the phrase is, "النية الحسنة لا تبرر الحرام." All right, so we all know the hadith of the intentions and how intentions are very important, and how our deen, subhanAllah, takes care of the intention that is behind the action, not just the action itself, right? And so the intention behind the action is very important, and it needs to be a noble intention, needs to be a pure intention, it needs to be one that is for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and there's lots of guidance when it comes to that, leading which is this hadith, which is very famous, and it is considered to be in the status of what is known as a mutawatir, meaning it's so widespread, this hadith, that it is so authentic. It's not just authentic, it's like very authentic in terms of its level of authenticity, because it was recited out loud. And it is, the narrator of the hadith is none other than Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anhu, where he says that the Prophet says, alayhi salam, "Innamal a'malu bin niyyah," and in other narrations, bin niyyat. Right? So there are different variations, small, tiny variations here and there. وَإِنَّمَا لِمْرِئٍ مَا نَوَى. And in another narration, وَإِنَّمَا لِكُلِّ امْرِئٍ مَا نَوَى. Right? So like I said, there are a bit of the variations here and there, but the overall meaning is pretty much the same, that the reward of deeds depends upon the intentions. And every person will get the reward according to what he or she has intended. Now, there is a bit of a context to this hadith, and the context is that it was during the migration, during the hijrah, where the people from Mecca were migrating, the Sahaba from Mecca, the companions of the Prophet were migrating from Mecca and running away really for their lives to Al-Madinah, fleeing persecution, fleeing the propaganda, fleeing the discrimination, fleeing all the torture and ridicule and mockery. And so they were really running for their lives from Mecca to Al-Medina, moving and migrating there. And as such, there was one person who is said did not have had the right intentions. So he migrated, but he migrated to marry someone named Qais. And so he became known as Muhajiru Qais, meaning the migrant of Qais. That was his intention. And so the hadith kind of continues after saying إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّةِ or بِالنِّيَّات, meaning that actions are based on their intentions. Then وَإِنَّمَا لِكُلِّ امْرِئٍ مَا نَوَى, and every person will attain the reward for their intention. And then the hadith also says, a continuation of it, فَمَنْ كَانَتْ هِجْرَتُهُ لِلَّهِ وَرَسُولِهِ فَهِجْرَتُهُ لِلَّهِ وَرَسُولِهِ. Whoever migrated to Allah and His Messenger, or for the sake of Allah and His Messenger, then their migration was for the sake of Allah and His Messenger. وَمَنْ كَانَتْ هِجْرَتُهُ لِدُنْيَا يُصِيبُهَا أَوْ امْرَأَةٍ يَنْكِحُهَا فَهِجْرَتُهُ إِلَى مَا هَاجَرَ إِلَيْهِ. But whoever's migration was to attain worldly gains, right, or to marry a specific woman, then their migration is for that which they migrated for. So that is the kind of the context of this hadith, but the meaning of it permeates into every action, to every deed that we are involved in. And so the author quotes this hadith and he highlights how that our deen takes care so much about the intention, tends to it and watches it and tells us to watch over it. And so he also highlights a very important idea and concept that is in our deen, and that is that through correct and pure and righteous intentions, regular routine actions become acts of worship. Right? This is what Imam Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, he says that it is turning our adat into ibadat. Our adat, meaning our routine habitual actions, they become not just actions or routine actions or things that every human being would do, they become acts of worship, they become ibadat, acts of servitude to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. How? By having the correct intention. So the author says, وَبِالنِّيَّةِ الطَّيِّبَةِ, with the right intention, with the correct intention, تَسْتَحِيلُ الْمُبَاحَاتِ وَالْعَادَاتِ إِلَى طَاعَاتِ. The acts that are permissible and the acts that are considered to be habitual routines, they become ta'at, acts of obedience and acts of servitude to Allah, وَقُرُبَاتِ مِنَ اللَّهِ, and enabling us to come closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through these actions. And he gives one example. He says, whoever, for example, has lunch with the intention of maintaining their own lives and strengthening their bodies so that they may go about their business in a way that is pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and in a way that upholds their duties towards Allah and towards their ummah, then their ta'am and their sharab, their food and their water becomes ibadah wa qurbah, becomes an act of obedience and servitude to Allah and an act of coming closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so this is a very powerful concept that comes from correct intention and righteous intentions. And this kind of teaches us something very interesting, that every human being, every creature for that matter, drinks water, is keen on having food. And so subhanAllah, when we put the right intention behind these routine actions, they become acts of servitude. And so for the believer who just has this paradigm shift, their actions are no longer just routine actions. They wake up for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They go to work for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, go to school for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They have breakfast for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They say salam to each other for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? Everything they do becomes an act of servitude as long as it's done for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the intention behind it is to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so subhanAllah, this is a beautiful thing that enables us to accumulate good deeds, right? Just by doing routine actions that we will do anyway, simply by having that mindset behind it. And then he quotes this hadith, the author. He quotes this hadith. This is narrated by At-Tabarani, and it goes as follows: "من طلب الدنيا حلالا تعففا عن المسألة وسعيا على عياله وتعطفا على جاره لقي الله ووجهه كالقمر ليلة البدر." Whoever seeks the lawful worldly life out of abstinence from begging, striving to provide for his family, and being kind to his neighbor, will meet Allah with a face like the moon on a full moon night. Now this hadith is encouraging that we seek dunya, right? That we seek the lawful of this world, but we do so with the right intention, right? To abstain from begging so that we're not in a position of poverty and so destitute to the extent that we have to extend our hands to other people, right? So we want to avoid that. That's one of the reasons. And we strive to provide for our families, right? So especially men, we have a duty to provide for our families. and that we are kind to our neighbors, we're kind to those that are around us. And as such, those that have this intention, they will meet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala like a full moon. So there's kind of a beautiful example here, or kind of encouragement given to us to seek worldly life, but to seek it with the right intention. And so, however, this is very important, that Islam does not accept that haram be taken as a means for a good end, right? You know the very famous saying that says that the means justify the end, or the end justify the means. I think that's the saying. The ends justify the means, right? If the ends are noble, then the means towards that end, they are justified, right? In the world, in this different world, subhanAllah, or in this world of ours, I should say, this is a Machiavellian concept, a concept that the idea that, what, any means, just do whatever it takes to make it happen. What matters is that it actually happens. And so this is not a justification that is acceptable by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so the author says here that this is actually a Machiavellian, way of thinking, that in fact in Islam, الوصول إلى الحق عن طريق الحق وحده. We can only attain truth by taking the means that is truthful in and of itself, right? And so the ends do not justify the means. And even Malcolm X is reported to have said something along these lines, that where he would say, by any means necessary, right? And so he kind of changed his understanding later on and recognized that our means cannot be the means of the devil, right? They cannot be the means of the evil person that we're actually fighting against. If we adopt their means, then we become no different than them. Because that's exactly how the devil tries to, or shaitan he tries to justify, subhanAllah, our evil actions by saying, the ends justify these actions. The ends justify these means. We're doing only this because the ends are noble. But the truth of the matter is, none of that is justified, subhanAllah. And so this is a very powerful, powerful concept. And so the author then says, he gives an example. He says, فَمَنْ جَمَعَ مَالًا مِنْ رِبًا أَوْ سُحْتٍ أَوْ لَهْوٍ حَرَامٍ أو قمار أو أي عمل محظور ليبني به مسجدا أو يقيم مشروعا خيريا لم يشفع له نبل قصده. Whoever collected their wealth through usury, through thievery, through haram entertainment, through gambling, through anything that is disapproved and disobeying of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, any means that is disobeying of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and then they use that wealth to build a masjid, for example, or to have some kind of charitable work, then he says here, لَمْ يُشْفَعْ لَهُ نُبْلَ قَصْدِهِ. Their noble cause will not intercede on their behalf. Their noble cause will not wipe away the means, the haram means that they took to attain whatever it is that they are attaining. And then the author reminds us of a very powerful hadith where the Prophet is reported to have said the following. He says, أيها الناس, O people, إن الله طيب لا يقبل إلا طيبا. Allah is good, and He therefore only accepts that which is good. وإن الله أمر المؤمنين بما أمر به المرسلين. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commanded the believers with exactly that which He commanded the messengers, by saying, and then he quotes a verse in the Quran, Surah Al-Mu'minun, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, يا أيها الرسل كلوا من الطيبات واعملوا صالحا إني بما تعملون عليم. O messengers, eat from what is good and lawful and act righteously. Indeed, I fully know what you do. This is a verse that is addressed to the Mursaleen, to the messengers, to the Rusul. And here in the hadith, the Prophet quotes this verse, and he says that Allah has commanded the believers with exactly that which He has commanded the messengers. And then he quotes another verse, and he says, يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا كُلُوا مِنْ طَيِّبَاتِ مَا رَزَقْنَاكُمْ. And then he stops there. But the verse continues, وَاشْكُرُوا لِلَّهِ إِن كُنْتُمْ إِيَّاهُ تَعْبُدُونَ. O believers, eat from the good things we have provided for you, and give thanks to Allah if you truly worship Him alone. The hadith continues, right? ثُمَّ ذَكَرَ الرَّجُلَ يُطِيلُ السَّفَرَ. So then he made mention of a person who travels widely. His hair is disheveled and covered with dust. أَشْعَثَ أَخْبَرَ. Right? يَمُدُّ يَدَيْهِ إِلَى السَّمَاءِ. He lifts his hand towards the sky. And he says, Ya Rabbi, Ya Rabbi. He says, oh my Lord, oh my Lord. And here the author comments about this. He says, this person that is yutilu safar, that is, travels widely, is not traveling for tourism. He puts between quotes, this is the author, Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi, he says, سَاعِيًا لِلْحَجِّ أَوْ الْعُمْرَةِ وَنَحْوِهِمَا, meaning this person is traveling for the sake of Hajj or the sake of Umrah, meaning they're traveling for a very noble endeavor, right? To the extent that their hair became disheveled and it's filled with dust, and they're really in a physical, difficult situation, so to speak, right? And they lift their hands towards the sky, saying, Ya Rabbi, oh my Lord, oh my Lord. However, whereas his diet is unlawful, right? The hadith says, وَمَطْعَمُهُ حَرَامٌ وَمَشْرَبَهُ حَرَامٌ. His drink is unlawful. وَمَلْبَسُهُ حَرَامٌ. His clothes are unlawful. وَغُذِّيَ بِالْحَرَامِ. And his nourishment is unlawful. And then the Prophet asks this question, فَأَنَّا يُسْتَجَابُ لِذَلِكَ. How can then his supplication be accepted? And this is the hadith. And the hadith is profound on many levels, subhanAllah. And it highlights perhaps some of what scholars say, the conditions for the dua to be accepted. That amongst the conditions for this person's dua, this person's supplication, not being accepted, the Prophet, he is, kind of reflecting or expressing that this person's supplication will not be accepted. How could it be accepted? And the reason is because of the haram that they have in their lives, the prohibited that they have in their lives. They have eaten unlawful, drank unlawful, their clothes is unlawful, their nourishment is from unlawful. And so how can such a person's actions or supplications be accepted? Subhanallah. And so this is hadith that the author is quoting to highlight something very profound, and that is that the means need to be just as lawful. They need to be in accordance to the Quran and Sunnah, just as the ends need to be in accordance to the Quran and Sunnah. He concludes this section, the author, by saying something. He says that when we do a good deed, it will erase a misdeed, right? A good deed erases a misdeed. So if somebody, for example, has done something wrong and they want to make up for it, they can, for example, give out in charity, and ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to forgive them. And so that would erase a misdeed. But then he says, إِنَّ اللَّهَ تَعَالَى لَا يَمْحُ السَّيِّئُ بِالسَّيِّئِ, meaning that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not erase a misdeed with a misdeed, right? وَلَكِنْ يَمْحُ السَّيِّئَ بِالْحَسَنِ, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala erases the misdeed with the good deed, right? And so it's a very kind of, poignant point here that the author ends this principle on. And we want to kind of conclude this section. This is not a hadith quoted by the author, by Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi, but it is a very famous hadith nonetheless, and it is in Sunan Tirmidhi, where we are told about the first group of people that will be tormented with hellfire, wal'iyadu billah. Right? So this is a sad situation, if you think about it. This is a hadith that you must have heard before. Right? This hadith is talking about what? It's talking about the person or the persons who didn't have the right intention. They did not have the right intention, unfortunately. And so what happened? They actually, unfortunately, they committed a heinous act. This heinous act was that they did something good, but they didn't have the right intention. I want to read to you the full hadith. I just, on the slides there, I just quoted it, briefly, that on the Day of Judgment, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will descend to his slaves, right, to judge between them. Every nation will be kneeling, and the first of those who will be called before him will be a man who memorized the Quran, and a man who was killed in Allah's cause, and a wealthy man. These three groups of people will be called upon, and they will be, invited to answer the question. They'll be questioned. The first people to be questioned are these groups of people, right? And so then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will ask the person who will start with the person who has memorized the Quran, right? And so he will be asked the question, and Allah will say to al-qari', أَلَمْ أُعَلِّمْكَ مَا أَنزَلْتُ عَلَى رَسُولِي, did I not teach you what I have revealed or bestowed upon my messenger? That's this person who has memorized the Quran will say, yes, my Lord, you have. Then Allah will ask, فَمَاذَا عَمِلْتَ فِيهَا? What did you do with it? Right? And so he will say, كنت أقوم به آناء الليل وآناء النهار. I used to perform, nightly prayers, and I used to recite with it. I would stand in prayer reciting with it during all hours of the night and all hours of the day. So he would recite the Quran during the day and during the night. And here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will respond to this person and say, كذبت, you lied. And the angels will also repeat and they will say, كذبت, you lied. ويقول الله بل أردت أن يقال أن فلانا قارئ فقد قيل. You did this so that it be said that this person is a reciter, and it has been said. It has been said. Then Allah will move on to the next person, right? صاحب المال, the one that had a lot of wealth. فيقول الله ألم أوسع عليك حتى لم أدعك تحتاج إلى أحد. Did I not expand in your wealth to the extent that you no longer needed anybody? He will say, yes, my Lord. Then Allah will ask him, فَمَاذَا عَمِلْتَ فِيمَا آتَيْتُكَ? What did you do with that which I bestowed upon you? He will say, كُنْتُ أَصِلُ الرَّحِمْ وَأَتَصَدَّقْ. I used to use the wealth to connect to my kin, to provide for them, to take care of them, and to give for charity. أَتَصَدَّقْ. فَيَقُولُ اللَّهُ, Allah will then say, كَذَبْتَ, you lie. And the angels will repeat, كَذَبْتَ. And so then Allah will say, بَلْ أَرَدْتُ أَنْ يُقَالُ, but you wanted instead that it would be said, فُلَانٌ جَوَادٌ فَقَدْ قِيلَ. You wanted people to say that you were generous, that you were a philanthropist, and it has been said. And then the person that died in the battlefield, in the battle that was for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, وَيُؤْتَى بِالَّذِي قُتِلَ فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ فَيَقُولُ اللَّهُ لَهُ, Allah will say to him, ماذا قتلت? What did you die for? فيقول أمرت بالجهاد في سبيلك فقاتلت حتى قتلت. I was commanded to wage jihad, right? To uphold the banner of truth and justice and to uphold righteousness. So I did so for your sake until I died. Allah will then say, كذبت, you lie. And the angels will say, you lied. And Allah will then say, you said you did this so that people will say about you such and such, that you were brave, that you were such a great person, etc., etc. وَقَدْ قِيلَ, and it has been said, right? And then the Prophet ﷺ, he struck Abu Hurairah. Abu Hurairah is the narrator of this hadith. The Prophet struck Abu Hurairah on the knee. ثم ضرب رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم على ركبتيه. He says that the Prophet then struck my knees. فقال يا أبو هريرة, O Abu Hurairah, أولئك الثلاثة أول خلق الله تسعر بهم النار يوم القيامة. These three people, O Abu Hurairah, are the first three of the creatures of Allah with whom the fire will be inflamed on the day of judgment. Now, one interesting thing, this is the story, this is the hadith in a nutshell. But the interesting thing about this hadith is how it was narrated. It says that a man from the Tabi'een who did not witness the Prophet ﷺ came to Abu Hurairah now being a very old man, who was of course amongst the companions, and said, "Oh Abu Hurairah, please share a hadith of the Prophet, share something the Prophet said to you." And then Abu Hurairah kept on saying, "You want me to narrate a hadith to you which the Messenger of Allah narrated to me that I understand and know?" And the man said, "Yes." And then Abu Hurairah kept on sobbing. He kept on crying. He would cry, and then the man is waiting for the hadith, and Abu Hurairah kept, he just couldn't control himself, subhanAllah, he kept on weeping. And then he kept on asking the question, "Do you want me to narrate this hadith, the saying of the Prophet ﷺ, that he has shared with me?" And the man says, "Yes." And Abu Hurairah keeps on weeping and keeps on sobbing here, right? SubhanAllah, the narration says, then again, Abu Hurairah began sobbing severely. Then he recovered and wiped his face. And he asked the question 3 times until the man said yes 3 times. And that's when Abu Hurairah said, "The Messenger of Allah narrated to me that on the Day of Judgment, Allah will descend upon His slaves to judge between them. Every nation will be kneeling, and the first of those that will be called upon Him are these 3 people." There is also a kind of what they call it at the end of the hadith. There are other narrators of the hadith, right? And so one of them is a man named Muawiyah, and he woke up, like it says here, Athaqa Muawiyah. He woke up, and he was in a state of right, grief after hearing this hadith. And he says, فُعِلَ بِهَؤُلَاءِ هَذَا فَكَيْفَ بِمَنْ بَقِيَ مِنَ النَّاسِ. Right, so he said, this is Muawiyah after recovering, he said, this has been done with these people, those three people. Then how about those who remain among the people? And so he began to weep intensely as well. And subhanAllah, this is a hadith that is, like I said, very famous, but it touches on the intention. It touches on the reason we do things. Do we strive to learn the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and try to teach it to others and try to adopt it in our lives just so that it be said about us, so that we boast, right? Like subhanAllah, you may have seen somebody posting on Instagram saying, oh, last night I had the most amazing Qiyamul Layl. It was so serene. It was so, peaceful. And all they're doing is boasting about it on social media. And subhanAllah, I think that this misses the mark. And we need to purify our hearts and recognize that the reward of our actions will not be found on the Day of Judgment if our intentions are not sincere. And so we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to purify our intentions and enable us to be amongst the sincere. All right, this is principle number 9, and it is a simple one, where the author says, it is avoiding the doubtful, to avoid that which is doubtful, for fear of falling into the prohibited. Okay, so what is this all about? So he says, اتقاء الشبهات خشية الوقوع في الحرام. And he quotes this verse in the Quran where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَقَدْ فَصَّلَ لَكُمْ مَا حَرَّمْ عَلَيْكُمْ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has already explained to you what He has forbidden to you. And so Allah made that which is haram clear and that which is halal clear. But there are sometimes an area in between, right? And sometimes there are those area that is in between that is considered, the gray area. And so the author says, فَأَمَّا الْحَلَالُ الْبَيِّنُ فَلَا حَرَجَ فِي فِعْلِهِ. What is halal clearly? There's no, anything against a person that does that which is clearly halal, clearly permissible. And as for the haram that is clearly haram, then there is no license to do it. There's no, reason to fall into it, right? And so this is the clear haram, clear halal. But between them, there's a in-between area, the gray area. And so my question, I guess, to the audience, why is there a gray area? And so I think before we move on, I want to kind of give the opportunity for the audience to share a few reflections. So in the comment section, just share some comments. What do you think? Why is there a gray area? Why is there a gray area? If you have any thoughts on that, inshallah, we'll then try to answer this question, inshallah, Ramin, before we continue. I'll tell you actually what the author said as well. All right, so one person says to test us. Another said that it is a mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Great answers, mashallah. And let's see what the author says. The author says that there is a gray area he mentions only 2 reasons. He says because there is sometimes ambiguity in evidence, right? The evidence itself, meaning the scripture, the text from the Quran or from the hadith, is not clear cut, right? It's not clear cut. That's one reason. There's some ambiguity there. But also the other reason, he says, there's ambiguity in the application of the evidence on this particular incident, right? Because the application of the incident, you have the evidence, maybe it's clear cut in its meaning, but does it apply to this incident, or is there ambiguity in this application? Meaning, is it an exact application that can be easily applied? You can quote the verse or quote the hadith and say it applies to this situation, or is there some ambiguity there? So that's reason number 2. But you're absolutely right. Like, from a perhaps more philosophical, perspective, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has wisdom in everything, right? And so when He allows for a gray area to exist, it is to allow for some mercy, to allow for the lines to not clearly be marked between black and white, because if that were the case, then any falling into the black would be sinful. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allows for the gray area to be there Some scholars have elaborated on this. They say, for example, there's so many different wisdoms that we can try to deduce. Amongst them, for example, is the fact that the gray area is an opportunity for us to recognize that it's getting a little bit dark here, right? So we need to perhaps return and take a few steps back, right? So sometimes we're going about our lives and then we find ourselves stepping into, gray zones, so to speak. And so we take a few steps back because we realize it then, as opposed to falling into sin and being on the black side already. So it's an opportunity out of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's mercy to recognize nearness to sin and take steps back. That's one thing. But also, it is because there may be circumstances, there may be situations that arise that perhaps where the gray area could be a legitimate solution. Instead of falling into sin, they can do that which is in the gray area instead. Right? So again, out of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's mercy and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's wisdom. There's a comment here that says, because Islam is not a list of rules, the foundations are applied differently. Absolutely. So Islam does have a list of rules, right? Al-Halal and Haram, the clear haram and clear halal. But there are certain areas that may arise over time, right? That wherein the rules are not necessarily, verbatim applicable, where now you apply the principles. And now since you have the foundations or you have the principles, now there may be a bit of, difference of opinion in terms of, okay, how do we apply these principles here? How do we apply these foundations here? Right? And so because human beings have different capacities and different scholars have different understandings and different levels of understandings, and so they may come to slightly different conclusions. So that's a good, answer to why there may be a difference of opinion. But here's the last point there. It says there's something called the ambiguity / clear-cut matrix. And so I will attempt to, as they say, trying to draw that, right? So let's see here. Let's see if there's a way. Trying to see if I can actually draw something. There must be a way for me to try to draw. Should have practiced this before, but basically, I wanted to be able to make a small diagram that can show you. Let's see. Is this? Right now, I don't think I have it in Google Meets. Maybe I need to go to the presentation. Yes, okay, I think I'll be able to share a different tab. Okay, so ambiguity / clear-cut matrix. The ambiguity / clear-cut matrix. There's, kind of the two, ideas here is that we have something called that which is ambiguous and that which is clear-cut. So ambiguous meaning that the meaning is not very clear, right? The meaning is not very clear. Clear-cut, the meaning is very clear, right? There's no questions about it. So that's one, one criteria. The meaning. Is the meaning clear or is the meaning ambiguous? And that refers to the text, meaning the verse in the Quran, the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. So that is number one.
Excuse me, sir. We can't see what you're writing.
Oh yes, no, I'm not writing anything. I'm just speaking. Oh, okay. So I'm gonna try to pull up a whiteboard and just make a very simple drawing, inshallah. So let me know if you can see this.
Yes, we can see that.
Okay, perfect. And so I'm hoping that I can draw. There we go. Perfect. So this is the ambiguity, okay, and the clear-cut matrix. So if we look at two things, we look at meaning, but we also look at something else in our deen, and that is not just the meaning of things, but also the reference itself. Is it clear-cut in its chain of narration, in its strength and authenticity, or is it ambiguous in its chain of narration and in its authenticity? And so this is what scholars have elaborated as, sahih, meaning authentic, and then you have hasan, which is mediocre, then you have da'if, which means weak. You also have other layers, other levels, so to speak, that scholars use, and that is to identify the authenticity of the evidence that is brought forth, right? The evidence being from the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. Okay, so now there are two aspects, meaning and chain of narration. Meaning and chain of narration. And so if we say that this is the ambiguity, okay, so imagine that's ambiguity, and this is where it says clear cut, meaning. And then on the side here, we want to put meaning, and then we want to put chain of narration. So that's not my handwriting. This is just how this whiteboard is interpreting my handwriting. Okay. And so this is what we're looking at. So when it comes to the Quran, the Quran is clear cut in its chain of narration, right? So this is where the Quran is at. It is clear cut in its chain of narration. But what about hadith? When it comes to hadith, the hadith, let's label this Q. Let's see. So this is where the Quran is at. Hadith is here, but also there are chain of narrations of hadith that are ambiguous. Why do I say the Quran is clear cut? Because the Quran is called mutawatir. So many people memorized it. So many people taught it to others. So many people became memorizers. Even today, in a gathering of believers, you just say, are there any huffaz here? Anybody memorize the Quran? You'll find a few hands that are raised, subhanAllah. This is just one of the beautiful miracles of the Quran, that the Quran has been so much memorized, so much passed on, that it became impossible to corrupt. And so you have the Quran is mutawatir, meaning that the chain of narration is so widespread, it is clear-cut in its chain of narration. There's no question about the authenticity of the Quran. But the hadith, that's not the case. People don't memorize a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ as often, and so you have hadith that are clear-cut, labeled and identified as sahih and authentic, but you also have hadith that are ambiguous in their chain of narration, right? And are weaker, or considered hasan or da'if in their chain of narration. Well, what about meaning? The meaning, some of it is here, and some of it is here, when it comes to both Quran and hadith. Sometimes the meaning in the Quran is not very clear-cut. This is what is called in the Quran mutashabihat, right? And so you have verses in the Quran that are not very clear-cut in their meaning. And the same with hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, that are not very clear-cut in their meaning. So this is just a very brief categorization, right? So we can tell now that when we have evidence, when we have text, whether it's Quran or hadith, and it happens to be, in this area here, right? Whether it's this or this, then it can be used easily, no problem. There's little difference of opinion about that. Okay? When it's here, then you have questions. And when it's here, you have questions as well. And you have difference of opinion that arises then, right? And so this is why, this is just an attempt to kind of, outline the two main important things. Basically, the ambiguity when it comes to the meaning, and ambiguity when it comes to chain of narration. This is why you have difference of opinion among scholars sometimes. So if you look at, for example, what are the differences of opinion by the way, not always, because last week, if you remember, and you can refer to that, we talked about a conceptual understanding. And so the conceptual understanding, both groups, there were two groups that are opposing each other, right? And they're opposing each other not diametrically, like it's not a huge opposition, right? It's not a huge difference of opinion. Basically, the leaders of the two, by the way, were Imam Shafi'i and Imam Malik. And Imam Malik, he believed in what is known as dar'ul al-dhara'a, right? Closing the doors or blocking the pretexts that could lead to haram. And he believed in this as a principle. And Imam Shafi'i said, no, it's not a principle, because if you consider it a principle, it would go against other principles, such as the principle or the concept that Allah is the only one that knows what is hidden, and we cannot judge what is hidden. So we cannot take it as a principle, but instead we look at the details of matters, and if there is a detail of the matter wherein it is proven that the action is taken with the intention of attaining that which is haram eventually, like they haven't done haram yet, but they're using the halal as a pretext for haram, then we can prohibit that pretext for that specific situation. So that's Imam Shafi'i's opinion, right? So you notice the two opinions are not so different, right? They're a bit different in terms of, is this a principle or not? Is it something that we should lay down as a foundational principle, or is it something that is in the details? Imam Shafi'i said it's in the details. Imam Malik said no, it's in the principle. So you see the difference of opinion arose not out of anything except perhaps you could argue ambiguity in the Quran about this matter. Like there is no clear-cut verse in the Quran that kind of settles this dispute, right? It's a deduction that Imam Malik had. He deduced it from his understanding of the verses and the hadith, and a deduction that Imam Shafi'i had, again, from the hadith and from the Quran, right? So this is just an example of difference of opinion, example of gray area, right? Now let's go back to the presentation and back to the principle as outlined by Imam or Sheikh Yusuf al-qaradawi. So that's why there's a gray area, okay? This is just a bit of a tangent to try to answer that question, because, very often we get this question, why is there a difference of opinion, right? Why don't all the scholars just agree? Why is there controversy on this matter, right? Shouldn't it just be, just one decision, one decree, one opinion, and that's it? Well, the answer is this. And it really comes down to the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but it could also be a test. Will we simply follow our whims and desires, or will we try to investigate, right? Try to, reach the correct decision on a matter, right? And exercise our faculties and exercise our intellect and ask scholars and read and research to try to reach the correct answer, right? Will we settle for simply following our whims and desires, and that's failure of the test, or will we try our best to attain the knowledge that is needed, and that is perhaps passing the test, inshallah. All right, so here's the very powerful hadith of the Prophet where he says, al-halal bayyin wal-haram bayyin wa baynahuma umur mushtabihat, or baynahuma mushtabihat, different narrations of the hadith. La ya'lamuha kathirun min an-nas. Not a lot of people know it. Right, so let's look at the translation here. There are legal and illegal things that are evident, but in between them there are doubtful, suspicious things. This is the gray area. Most of the people have no knowledge about them. So then the Prophet says, alayhi salam, فَمَنِ اتَّقَى الْمُشَبَّهَاتِ اسْتَبْرَأَ لِدِينِهِ وَعِرْضِهِ. Right? Whoever avoids the mushabbihat or al-mutashabihat, avoids the gray area, فَقَدْ اسْتَبْرَأَ لِدِينِهِ وَعِرْضِهِ. Now, it literally means they announce the innocence of their deen. They announce the innocence of their honor. Now let's see what the translation says. Whoever saves himself from these suspicious things saves his religion and his honor. Right? So just a different translation, right? وَمَنْ وَقَعَ فِي الشُّبُهَاتِ كَرَاعٍ يَرَى حَوْلَ الْحِمَى يُوشِكُ أَنْ يُوَقِعَهُ. It translates to that whoever falls into the suspicious areas, they'll be like a shepherd who grazes his animals near the hima, meaning the private pasture of someone else. And at any moment, he is liable to fall into it or get into it. And then the Prophet says, O people, right? O people, أَلَا وَإِنَّ لِكُلِّ مَلِكٍ حِمَى. Every king has a hima, has a protected pasture. أَلَا إِنَّ حِمَى اللَّهِ فِي أَرْضِهِ مَحَارِمُهُ. The protection or the protected area of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, every king has a hima. And the hima of Allah on the earth is his illegal forbidden things. This is what Allah prohibited, is what the area that Allah forbade us from going into, right? So beware of this. Oops. Beware of this. And then he says the following. The Prophet says the following. ألا وإن في الجسد مضغة إذا صلحت صلح الجسد كله وإذا فسدت فسد الجسد كله ألا وهي القلب. There is indeed a piece of flesh in the body. If it becomes good, the whole body becomes good. But if it gets spoiled, the whole body gets spoiled, and this is the heart. This hadith, by the way, is very profound. And I think we quoted the hadith before, but we didn't perhaps reflect on it too much. But this hadith tells us that there is a gray area, and it is what is called al-mutashabihat, or mushtabihat, or mushabbahat. These are different words for the same meaning that it is a gray area, controversial area, suspicious area, doubtful area. And whoever keeps on revolving around the suspicious area or falls into the suspicious area, they're very close into falling into the haram area, right? Think of it this way. The doubtful matters is simply a step closer to that which is haram. When we avoid the doubtful matters, we're taking a few steps back, which from something that may be halal, right? But by extension, we're also taking a few steps back from that which we know is haram, right? And so here is an encouragement to do just that. The author quotes this hadith and he uses it as an encouragement, and he calls it al-wara', right? Al-wara', which is this inner desire in our hearts to, do the extra, to do that which is even better, to stay clear from that which is even doubtful, right? And so he says, it is أن يتجنب المسلم هذه الشبهات, that the believer strives to stay away from that which is doubtful, right? He even says it's also a type of sadd al-dhara'a. It is a type of blocking the pretexts, right? We talked about blocking pretext before. He says it is a type of that. And so here, the age-old question, and there is a bit of a difference of opinion, a bit, not a big difference of opinion, but a bit of a difference of opinion. Majority of scholars say that al-wara', which is this desire to stay away from the doubtful area and to stay away from to take a safe distance from haram, a halal safe distance from haram, right? So even things that are halal, we stay clear just because we know that this halal is too close to the haram, right? You know what I mean? So he says that doing that is called al-wara', and that is commendable. It's not obligatory. That's the majority opinion. There is a minority opinion, very small minority opinion, that says no, wara' is not commendable. It's something we have to do. The Prophet says, and they quote this same hadith, and this shows, how sometimes there could be difference of opinion. They quote this same hadith and they say, the Prophet said, whoever saves himself from the suspicious things, they're saving their religion, they're saving their honor. It means if you don't save yourself from that which is suspicious, you're not saving your religion, you're not saving your honor, right? They focus on that area where the Prophet says, alayhi salam, man ittaqa, right? Man ittaqa ash-shubuhati faqad istabra'a li dinihi wa 'irdihi, right? So they focus on that area. So this is just to highlight this principle, and the principle is that it is an act that is commendable, that is the agreed upon by majority of scholars, commendable, to try to avoid that which is doubtful out of keenness to stay clear and farther away from that which is haram. All right, principle number 10. The prohibited is prohibited for all. There's no ambiguity about this one. This one is clear cut. This is easy, an easy principle. And so we know the very famous story of a woman who committed thievery, and she was wealthy. And some of the Sahaba, they said, you know what, we want to kind of try to intercede, to try to ask the Prophet to, forsake her, to forgive her, to not punish her for her thievery. And so they said, who should we ask to ask the Prophet? They said, nobody will go and have, face to ask the Prophet this, except Usama ibn Zayd, the grandson of the Prophet, the adopted grandson of the Prophet. Zayd was adopted by the Prophet, and he became known as Zayd ibn Muhammad for the longest time, before his name was returned to Zayd ibn Haritha. And so Zayd is raised by the Prophet. Zayd's son is Usama. So Usama is kind of like the grandson of the Prophet. He's not his biological grandson, but his adopted grandson. So they said, oh, Usama, he was around 15, 16 at the time, please go talk to Muhammad about this woman. Try to intercede on her behalf. Try to ask for his forgiveness. So he does that. So the Prophet's face turned red out of anger. In other narrations, not in this one, but the Prophet's face is described as turning red out of anger. And he says to Usama, أتشفع في حد من حدود الله? Are you interceding with me to violate one of the legal punishments of Allah? Like, how dare you do this? This is the attitude of the Prophet. ثم قام فخطب. Then the Prophet rose up and addressed all the people. And he said, يا أيها الناس إنما ضل من قبلكم أنهم كانوا إذا سرق الشريف تركوه وإذا سرق الضعيف فيهم أقاموا عليه الحد. What caused people before you, nations before you, to go astray and to be devastated as a result of it is that when the rich and noble amongst them commits thievery, they used to leave them. They didn't apply the law to them. But if a weak person amongst them committed it, they used to inflict legal punishment on him. So what is he talking about here, alayhi salatu? He's talking about the unequal, act of law or application of the law upon people. And then he says, by Allah, وَيْمَ اللَّهِ لو أن فاطمة بنت محمد سرقت لقطع محمد يدها. If Fatima, the daughter of Muhammad, committed theft, Muhammad will cut off her hand. Even if my own daughter committed thievery, she would get the punishment that is applicable on everybody, regardless of their social status, their nobility of lineage, their wealth, their power, their fame, their glory. All of that doesn't matter. The law is applied equally upon all. And this is a very, very powerful statement from the Prophet, and a powerful lesson until the end of time. And subhanAllah, it resonates, I think, the idea of justice in Islam, the idea that the law is applied to all, the idea that no one is above the law. Justice for all, basically, not justice for some. By the way, a very interesting book written about the Palestinian cause that kind of highlights how the international law and the international system, unfortunately, applies justice only for some, but not for all, and specifically neglects justice for the Palestinian people, is a book written by Noura Arayqat, and the title of the book is Justice for Some. Very interesting book, and I recommend you check it out. Here, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, إِنَّا أَنزَلْنَا إِلَيْكَ الْكِتَابَ بِالْحَقِّ لِتَحْكُمَ بَيْنَ النَّاسِ بِمَا أَرَاكَ اللَّهُ وَلَا تَكُنْ لِلْخَائِنِينَ خَصِيمًا. Indeed, we've sent down the book to you, O Prophet, in truth, to judge between people by means of what Allah has shown you. Bima arak Allah, right? You're judging using what Allah has shown you, not your own whims, not the whims and desires of people. Do not be an advocate for those that are deceitful. And there's a context to this verse. The Shaykh al-qaradawi reflects upon. He says, at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, there was some kind of thievery that happened, and there were suspicions against a Muslim and a Jewish person. And some of the relatives of the Muslim person were able to kind of push the suspicions further against the Jewish person in their efforts to, forsake the Muslim person who was a friend of theirs, right? And so the author says, وَهُوَ فِي الْوَاقِعِ مُرْتَكِبُ السَّرِقَةِ. The one that actually committed the crime was the Muslim, not the Jewish person. And so here, the Prophet ﷺ was about to, act based on the evidence that he sees in front of him, until Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed these verses, pretty much showcasing and highlighting the treachery of the people, of the believers, and declaring the innocence of the Jewish person. And even there is amongst these verses a bit of a condemnation, a bit of scolding to the Prophet ﷺ, and putting the rightful truth in its rightful place. And so the verses, these are the verses from 105 to 109 of Surah An-Nisa. So this is another example. And here is a third example that the author highlights, and that is talking about the people of the book, specifically Jewish people. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَمِنْ أَهْلِ الْكِتَابِ مَنْ إِنْ تَأْمَنْهُ بِقِنْطَارٍ يُؤَدِّهِ إِلَيْكَ. There are some among the people of the book, amongst the Jewish people, who, if entrusted with a stack of gold, they will readily return it. Meaning they have honesty, they have integrity, they have trustworthiness, right? But that's not all of them. right? ومنهم من إن تأمنه بدينار لا يؤديه إليك إلا ما دمت عليه قائما. Yet there are others who, if entrusted with just a single coin, will not repay it back unless you constantly demand it. Now, why is this the case? Why is there a group of the people of the book, not all of them, remember, there's a group that is trustworthy and honest and has integrity, but there's another group that even if you entrust with a little coin, just a single coin, they would not be trustworthy with it. Why is that the case? Allah says this. Why? Because ذلك بأنهم قالوا ليس علينا في الأميين سبيل ويقولون على الله الكذب وهم يعلمون. This is because they say we're not accountable for exploiting the Gentiles. And so they attribute lies to Allah knowingly. Meaning, this group of people, from the people of the book, from the Jewish people, have unfortunately warped their faith, warped their deen, warped their revelation to say that they are not sinful for exploiting non-Jews, right? It's a very interesting concept. And it's very important to highlight that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala starts this verse by highlighting this is not all of them, this is some of them. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala later on says, لَيْسُ سَوَاءً, they're not all the same. And so some of them have done this. They've warped their books, they've warped their scripture to justify their actions. Remember the principle that said that, the ends justify the means? They've done just that. They said, you know what? We'll justify our means. We're allowed to exploit those that are not Jewish, to steal from them, to take from them, and we won't be sinful for doing so. And so this is such a horrible, horrible, racist, supremacist attitude that exists till this day. The author actually attributes to this, right? He attributes to this idea, this racist ideology and understanding. He says, هذه النزعة الإسرائيلية. This is the Israeli, right, tendency. This is the Zionist understanding. This is the author's words. And so it's very, very interesting to highlight this. And so he says that they, instead of applying the same principles of truth, justice, fairness, equality, right, and kindness and generosity to all people, they've limited this circle to themselves, to their own tribe, to their own people. That we have to be nice to each other. We have to be honest to each other. We can't exploit one another. But when it comes to other people, they say, "Oh no, these rules don't apply to them. We can exploit them. We can steal from them. We can do this to them." Right? But what Islam has done is that it expanded this circle to apply to all people, and that there is no difference between people, and that justice is applied to all, and law is applied to all. And so this is a very, very powerful concept that the author comments on. Another example he highlights stemming from this, he says that, some people from the Jewish faith that have corrupted it, they corrupted their Jewish faith and corrupted their Jewish scriptures. They claimed that usury is, haram between Jews. It is impermissible between Jews, but it is permissible when it comes to dealing with a Gentile or a non-Jew. And as such, this, by the way, this concept is what led to usury being introduced as a worldwide concept that led to the economic system that we have today, subhanAllah. If you kind of trace its roots, it will lead you, we will all rise from this understanding, subhanAllah. All right, we'll come down to the last principle number 11. In this principle, inshallah, we will touch upon a very important concept, and that is necessities permit the impermissible. الضرورات تبيح المحظورات. The author says, our Islam did not neglect what is necessary to life, right? And that in life there are moments of necessity, moments of need that may perhaps result in an exception to the rule. An exception to the rule, right? Okay, so he quotes this verse as the guiding principle. فَمَنِ اضْطُرَّ غَيْرَ بَاغٍ وَلَا عَادٍ فَلَا إِثْمَ عَلَيْهِ إِنَّ اللَّهَ غَفُورٌ رَحِيمٌ. If someone is compelled by necessity, neither driven by desire, nor exceeding immediate need, they will not be sinful. Truly Allah is all forgiving, most merciful. And so he says this is the guiding principle, that it's not, you're not driven by desire, you're not following your whims, you're not doing things because they're pleasurable to you, right? Nor have you exceeded what is needed, right? There's a need, granted, you meet that need, but don't exceed it. Don't go beyond it, right? And so that's the guiding principle to this understanding. And so he says this brings us to a fiqhi maxim. So fiqh, meaning jurisprudence and understanding of law, or methodology of law, there are maxims of fiqh that the scholars have agreed upon. And different schools of fiqh have slightly variations here and there. This is one of them that is agreed, and that is what is made permissible out of necessity is evaluated based on the extent of the necessity. In Arabic, it goes as follows: ما أبيح للضرورة يقدر بقدرها. Right? What is made permissible out of necessity is evaluated based on the extent of the necessity. So if there's a necessity, let's say somebody's walking in the desert and they're starving and they finish the food that they have and the water that they have, and now they're in a state of hunger. So they're in a state of necessity. And then the only living animal that they're able to hunt is actually a wild boar or a wild pig, right? So then what do? There's a necessity. It's impermissible to eat such an animal and to hunt it and to eat it. So unfortunately, because of the necessity, they're going to have to make an exception. So they're going to hunt that animal and eat that animal. Now, do they create a gourmet meal, or do they simply satisfy themselves content enough so that they survive? Right? So that's the question. Right? The extent of it is based on the necessity, and that is that they were starving. Right? So it should not go beyond that. And this comes, actually, the author says, from the understanding that we covered previously, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants ease for us. يُرِيدُ اللَّهُ بِكُمْ الْيُسْرَ وَلَا يُرِيدُ بِكُمْ الْعُسْرَ. Does not want hardship for us. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants not to burden us. وَمَا يُرِيدُ اللَّهُ لِيَجْعَلَ عَلَيْكُمْ مِنْ حَرَجٍ وَلَكِنْ يُرِيدُ لِيُطَهِّرَكُمْ. Allah wants to purify us. وَلِيُتِمَّ نِعْمَتَهُ عَلَيْكُمْ. And complete His favor upon us. لَعَلَّكُمْ تَشْكُرُونَ. That we be amongst the grateful. يُرِيدُ اللَّهُ أَنْ يُخَفِّفَ عَنْكُمْ وَخُلِقَ الْإِنسَانُ ضَعِيفًا. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants to lighten our burden, and Allah recognizes that we have been created in a state of weakness. A state of weakness. This is, subhanAllah, the natural state that we as human beings are in, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala recognizes this and understands this, subhanahu wa ta'ala, from His from above the highest of heavens, right? And so this is where we kind of conclude, I believe. Yes, we reached the conclusion of the series, alhamdulillah Ramin, and we want to kind of open the floor for comments and reflections and thoughts and questions. And we also want to address one question that I got via text message based on last session. So I'm going to kind of talk about that, inshallah, briefly. But before we go there, I want to see if anybody has any comments or questions on your side, inshallah, and then we will conclude. Any questions, comments, or reflections? All right, Bismillah. So we have a few specific questions here. One question says, Assalamu alaikum, wa alaikum salam. Is going to Hajj in an unlawful manner, visa trickery, nullifies it? I had this argument with someone who said since the arkan of Hajj were respected, it is still valid, but the way it was done is sinful. So that's a very good question. And the answer, wallahu alam, that I've found from other scholars, including Sheikh Muhammad Hassan al-Baddaru, is that no, it does not nullify it. Okay? Because the Prophet never said that amongst the conditions of Hajj is that you have to get the correct visa, for example, right? That's not said. So we can't put in our own, rules for the sha'ira, for the act of worship to be accepted by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We can't put our own rules into place. Now, are they sinful for violating the rules? That's a different question. That is the question that should be asked, right? So does it nullify the Hajj or the Sha'ira or the Umrah or what have you? The answer is no. It does not nullify it. But are they sinful? That's the question that should be asked. Now, are they sinful or not? That depends on a lot of things. It depends on whether the law itself is fair, whether they is it abiding by the Quran and Sunnah? These are questions that you can kind of have to grapple with. And for the most part, I do believe that they are sinful if they do violate, the rules, because the rules are put in place to ensure, numbers, to ensure the safety of the Hujjaj, the people that are there. Yes, there are negative side effects that perhaps, Hajj or Umrah becomes very expensive compared to perhaps going through the alternate routes, which may not be as expensive, right? But it's very important to recognize that. But then you might ask the question, okay, what if it's a necessity? Well, what do you mean a necessity? Well, they can't afford the regular Hajj. They can only afford this Hajj. And so then, like I said, there might be a reason that perhaps they're not as sinful because they wanted to ensure that they perform Hajj and that's what they can afford. But then perhaps an argument back to them is that, okay, if you can't afford it, then maybe the whole faridah drops from you, right? Like you're no longer obligated to perform Hajj anymore because you can't afford it. But then there's a back and forth, you know what I mean, that can happen when it comes to this. But I do believe that, trying to adhere to the law is important, very important, because one of the things that we do when we enter into that land is that we make kind of a tacit, maybe not explicit, but implicit promise that we will abide by the law of the land, right? We're entering into the land as guests, where we sign a document about, our entry, and we, in a way, are making that promise. And the laws are put in place in such a way to ensure, safety and to ensure. Now, you can argue, by the way, against that, but and that's what I think. I think they're put in to ensure safety. There are some negative side effects, like I said, the cost of Hajj and Umrah, but I think we covered that. Alhamdulillah. All right. There's another question that says, I heard that drop shipping is haram, and from others that it isn't, and so I'm confused. I think it's because drop shipping itself is a bit confusing. Like, what is drop shipping? So some people define it differently. But I think that if you consider drop shipping to be that you have not purchased the item, right? You've not purchased a cell phone, for example, but you are selling it. In other words, you have a website and you're posting, I don't know, it could be an eBay account, and you're posting on that eBay account that you are willing to sell this cell phone to whoever buys it, but you don't have the product. It's not yours. So basically, this is what makes it problematic, because in a way you're lying, right? You don't have the product, right? But what you do have is access to it, right? So maybe you can clarify that and say, I don't have the product, but I have access to it, right? And so I will only, kind of charge once I ship the product. Indeed, if I don't, I won't. If I can't get the product, maybe the access is, nullified in such a way, then I don't have the product, and I won't, sell you the product, and as such, you get a full refund or something like that. Then you're working around what could be perceived as a lie, right? And then there's the other aspect, that the person that actually owns the product, whom you are planning on purchasing from at a cheaper rate and then selling it at an exuberant rate, or higher rate, let's not say exuberant, higher rate on that eBay account of yours, they don't know about this. They don't know that you've done this, right? And so there is a bit of what is known as al-gharar, meaning that there's a bit of cheating when it comes to buying and selling, right? When it comes there. And so some scholars say you need their permission, because you're using their product, you're even taking their pictures and their product data and their information, and you're posting it as if you have it, and you're putting it on, and you're saying, I have all the information, I have this is the product, without taking the owner of the product's permission to resell, right? And so this is where some scholars are iffy about it, and they say, if you have their permission, or if they are selling with the understanding that others can buy and sell, or buy in bulk and sell, right? Or if you, meaning if permission is known, or if culturally it's understood that that's the case, and they're fine with it, the original owners of the product, they have the product in stock, it's theirs, they're the ones selling it at a cheaper rate. If they are fine with this, they're okay with it, culturally or explicitly, through permission, through license, through commission, through what have you, then scholars say then you've worked around that. But then there's another aspect to this as well, right? And so we just covered some of the aspects. There are probably others as well, but that's why dropshipping is a bit difference of opinion about it, because it depends on how or what you mean by dropshipping. All right, I hope that answers that question. All right, let's touch on the question that I got over a message because of last week. Here it is. It says that if our sisters are going to be forced to take public transportation or walk to places, then this would cause undue hardship, right? This is specifically referring to Uber, right? So the question was, can our sisters take, Uber rides, or would it be, or is it considered khalwa because it would cause undue hardship for our sisters? And I actually mentioned last time that, and let's clarify it this time as well, that an Uber car is not necessarily khalwa. So what is khalwa? Khalwa is when, and the Prophet mentions it in a hadith, when a man and a woman are alone, he says the shaitan is the third. Okay, so what is alone? Alone is typically where a sin may happen, right? A sin may happen. So is being alone in the car considered alone where a sin may happen? And I think it depends on a few things. It depends on what is culturally considered to be alone, because maybe this is not considered alone culturally because, the windows are all clear, people can see it's daylight, it's not dark, windows are not tinted, they are not alone 100%, right? They're not alone 100%, but they are alone somewhat. So I think the correct, understand why are they alone somewhat? Because if they do have a conversation, that conversation is not heard by anybody outside. You could be even right beside the car and you can't hear the conversation. And so they are, in a way, not 100% khalwa, but a significant percentage of khalwa. And so, is this right or is it wrong? And then I shared the opinion, my opinion, not a fatwa, by the way, because I'm not, up to the level of giving fatwas, but my opinion is that unless you have a necessity, right? Remember the last ruling that we just shared, right? That, things can become permissible because of necessity. Unless there is a necessity, I would say avoid this. Avoid being alone as a sister with a brother in a car or even a non-Muslim man in a car. Avoid it unless there's a necessity. So what is a necessity? That is something that needs to be evaluated. Let's say there's a storm, rain or snow, right? Very difficult to walk outside, very difficult to take public transportation. Or let's say there's an emergency where you are in a hurry, in a rush, there's no time to take public transportation, right? And there was no other opportunity to have a group of sisters together or to have a mahram with you, right? And so then all of the, the situations have put where the only option is to take an Uber or to take a taxi because both are kind of the same, right? Then I think it's okay, inshallah. But don't be nonchalant about it, right? Don't be like, oh, it's okay, it's no problem. Because that's kind of similar to somebody that's, in the desert that's enjoying, the roasted ham, right? Oh, it's okay, it's halal right now. No, it's not exactly halal. It's just that it became permissible because there was a dire situation, because there was a necessity, right? And don't, go gourmet, right? Just take the necessity, do the extent of the necessity, and limit yourself to that. Again, this is my personal opinion. And because if you Google, situations where Uber drivers or taxi drivers committed, acts of tyranny and abuse against women that they took as passengers, you'll find plenty of situations like that. Now, this is not to scare our sisters, but so that they realize that, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala prohibited something for a reason, right? And that is for her own safety. And so we as Muslims should also cherish that safety, right? So, but if there is, like I said, if there is a situation where there's no way around it, then khair, inshallah, just be careful, be vigilant, be watchful, try to make sure that your guardian is aware and approving, because this is, by the way, very, very, very important for our sisters, that their guardians are the ones that actually are in charge of their safety, whether it be their fathers until they get married, their husbands, right? So, in other words, doing this, going on a ride with a stranger, non-mahram, whether it Uber or taxi, without your guardian knowing about it, that's what everybody else does, but not a Muslim, right? Because your guardian should be aware and should be kind of approving in a sense, because he is in charge of your safety. You are not in charge of your own safety. Now, of course, some sisters may be like, well, we have our own agency, we are our own women, we have our own power, I don't need my guardian for this, right? And that's true to some extent in the world that we live in some places, But in other places, that may not be the case. I know Ottawa, alhamdulillah, generally is a very safe place, but I don't feel, confident to say the same about Toronto, for example, right? Also depends on where in Ottawa, right? Like if you're in Vanier, for example, it's not as safe as Barhaven. So, you know what I mean? So we have to be mindful of these things and be careful and recognize that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala prohibited something, it is because that there's good in that prohibition. And we are just, out of convenience and out of ease of use are making things permissible, but we shouldn't be nonchalant about it. We should be careful and vigilant. Allah. Again, just an opinion, take it with a grain of salt. Feel free to ignore it if you so choose. There's a comment here that says, I'm not sure to understand why a permission is needed to resell a product if after buying it, you are the owner of it. And so that's an excellent question. That's, I think, about drop shipping. I think if you buy it, then you don't need permission. But if you haven't bought it yet, that's where the permission aspect arises, right? In other words, if you are just putting a post up on eBay, but you don't have the product in hand, that's why it's called drop shipping, right? But if you have the product, you've bought it, then you don't need anyone's permission. It's your product. You can sell it with whatever price you have. You can use your own pictures. You can, you know what I mean? It's your product. But what if you don't have the product? It's not yours yet. And yet you're putting a post about it that you're selling it. That's where dropshipping has become, it's not direct selling anymore, right? So that's why they say it could be cheating the person that actually owns the product, right? And hence there's a bit of difference of opinion about it. Right, there's a comment here. There's also another fiqh principle that needs take the status of necessities. For example, in today's world, an education is needed. We won't die if we don't get one, but you do need it. So it stands the position of necessities. And that's a good question. What is necessities? By the way, this last principle that we shared, ad-darurat tubihu al-mahdhurat, scholars agree about this. Like they agree that, necessities make what is impermissible become permissible temporarily until the necessity is met, right? What they differ about is what constitutes a necessity. So for example, the post here, the brother asking the question says, education is a necessity. Others may disagree, right? And so there's difference of opinion. And so on many matters, there are differences of opinion. Another difference of opinion is very common, is buying a house. Is owning a house a necessity? And as such, the whole fatwa of the European Council that gave a fatwa that says that you can use, a mortgage bank if there's no other halal alternative to finance a house and buy a house, because buying a house is a necessity. But there are others that disagree with that fatwa based on the premise that they say buying a house is not a necessity. Having shelter is a necessity, but that does not necessarily mean it has to be represented, or having that shelter needs to be in the form of buying a house, right? There could be other forms of shelter. And so that's where the disagreement arises, right? And so what is a necessity is a very large topic of discussion that it really depends on the situation, because also what may be a necessity for one person may not necessarily be a necessity for another. For one person, maybe they have many children, they're unable to rent because nobody will rent to a large family that has a lot of children, and they can't rent something small because then their own privacy will be at stake, right? So they need something a little bit bigger, and as such, the things that are bigger are not available. So for them, you could perhaps argue that having a house, owning a house, becomes a necessity. Is that the same for somebody that is like a single person that is not even married? I don't think so. I don't think the necessities are the same, right? And so that's where, that's why some, kind of jurisprudence or understanding or discussion is required when it comes to what is a necessity. It's not a blanket statement that what is a necessity for one is a necessity for everybody. It could be different, could be situational, right? So this is just one example that we just brought up. Another question says, can women go to Umrah without a mahram? Excellent question. Can she go to Umrah without a mahram? You have opened Pandora's box. So there is a bit of difference of opinion about that. Can a woman travel without a mahram? Or does she require to have a mahram to travel? And so it is very important to realize that all schools of fiqh have agreed that for a woman to travel, she needs to have a mahram. Now, today's scholars, modern scholars, are kind of questioning this because the situation today has changed, right? And again, I think it's one of those situations where it falls a bit into the gray area a bit. The safer, of course, opinion is a mahram has to be there when a woman travels. And again, why is this the case? Why did the Prophet ﷺ put this in place? Because that was the situation at the time, and for the longest time, where a woman's safety really cannot be guaranteed. And so to guarantee her safety, a mahram would be there. And we live in a time where, there is no special emphasis on women's safety in the West. Like a woman's safety is just like a man's safety. But that's not the case in Islam. In Islam, a woman's safety is actually given more importance, more precedence. And the reason is because in Islam, we recognize that a man can perhaps defend himself, but a woman, not necessarily. And I know that Hollywood and Bollywood has come up with these kung fu movies where there are women that beat, thousands of the men because they have this kung fu training. But you know what? It's fantasy, it's fiction, it's not true, right? So you gotta kind of realize that no matter how much, martial arts training a woman has, she might be able to defend herself a little, but never as they show in the movies. So it's very important to realize all of these things and put them in perspective and recognize them, and as such, to protect our sisters and our women. That's why the rule is in place that she needs to have a mahram to travel. Now, what if there is no mahram? Right? What if there's a situation where she needs to travel, she must travel, there's a necessity, there's an emergency, right? Then you can argue and say, okay, the last ruling, the last principle that we covered, necessities can allow for things to become permissible. But don't be, again, nonchalant about it. But then what about like traveling for leisure, for fun? Then I think here the guardian has a say in whether he ensures the safety concerns are met. Because let's say she's traveling from city to city and it's on a train and things are safe, generally speaking, because we live in a very, as they say, highly surveilled society today. This is not the case just 20, 30 years ago, right? So things are different today than they were in the past, where safety concerns can be met and can be mitigated in different ways as opposed to having a mahram all the time. But that even said, there are also safety concerns about walking at night. There are safety concerns about being in the dark. Dark right now is earlier than usual, right? SubhanAllah. So we need to kind of always bear these things in mind. Traveling all over the world, across oceans, across seas, amongst strangers, there's always, challenges. There's always worries about the safety, even regardless of how safe, the world is today compared to the past. And so I would argue that, try to have a mahram with you. If you do not have a mahram when it comes to Umrah, go to Umrah with a mahram. But if you don't have a mahram with Umrah, then go with a group of sisters, a group of people that are together. Could be an MSA group, it could be, whatever group. So that kind of can make up for the mahram, but also provide the safety and security that is needed, right? Wallahu alam. These are tough questions, but these are just some thoughts about them, inshallah. All right, I think we don't have any other questions that are outstanding, and we can stop here, inshallah. I hope you found this series to be beneficial. I hope you found it to be enlightening. I hope that encourages you to check out, the book Al-Halal and Haram in Islam, the lawful, the prohibited in Islam by Sheikh al-qaradawi, and to dive into it more in depth. I hope you found the slides to be beneficial, inshallah. I shared them and they're pinned, I think, to this chat. And inshallah, as well, the organizers will share them with everybody that registered. Barakallahu feekum, jazakumullah khair. Any mistakes I've said are my own. Please forgive me for them. Anything good I said are from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. Please ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to accept them from me and to reward me and my family and to preserve me. Please remember me and my family in your dua. Jazakumullah khairan. Barakallahu feekum. We hope to see you in the near future, inshallah. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.